In this Blender tutorial, I will show you how I made a low-poly modular dungeon pack in Blender. In part 1, I will show you how I made the floor, pillar, walls, and steps for the dungeon pack. In part 2, I will show you how I made the remaining assets, such as crates and flags. This tutorial was a request from Amjad Ali. I will be using the Godot game engine for testing, but you can use any game engine you wish. Since I will be making assets to specific measurements, I changed my units to Imperial under the Scenes property. I will begin by making the floors. I delete the cube, and I add a plane. I make sure that the 3D cursor is at the bottom center of the plane. Under the Object menu, I set the origin to the 3D cursor. I open the Properties panel and set the X and Y axes 6 feet. In edit mode, I extrude the plane along the Z-axis by 0.25 feet. In object mode, I use Ctrl-A to apply the scale. I add a cube and I scale it to the size of a I then align the brick to the floor. I add an array modifier and increase the count to fit the horizontal space of the wall. And then I'll adjust the size of the bricks as needed. Then I apply the modifier. And add a second array modifier. I fill up the rest of the floor and then apply the modifier. Then join both objects by using Ctrl-J. And then I change the name in the outliner. Then I hide the floor object. I will now make a pillar. I add a cube. And using the Properties panel, I change the X and Y to 1 foot. And I change the Z to 0.25 feet. Under the Object menu, I set the origin to the 3D cursor. I add a second cube and place it on top of the first cube. And change the X and Y dimensions to 0.75. And the Z dimension to 5.5. I duplicate the bottom of the pillar and place it on top of the pillar. I join all 3 sections of the pillar and then apply the scale. I rename the cube in the outliner. In edit mode, I add 4 horizontal loop cuts to the center section of the pillar. Then I add edge loops to each side of the original loop cuts by using Ctrl-Shift-R. I then select these new faces and then I'll extrude them in toward the center of the pillar using Alt-E. I tab back into object mode and I hide the pillar. I'll now move on to the wall. I add a cube. I scale it to 6 feet along the x-axis, 0.5 feet on the y-axis, and 6 feet on the z-axis. I add a cube and scale it to the size of a brick. Then I line the brick to the wall. I add an array modifier and I increase the amount to fill the horizontal space of the wall. And adjust the brick size as needed. I then apply the modifier. In edit mode, I duplicate the bricks and move them down below the original bricks. Then I offset the second row of bricks. Making sure that I add 2 shorter bricks to each end of the row. In object mode, I add another array modifier to fill in the rest of the wall. And then I apply the modifier. I then move the bricks along the y-axis, so they're sitting about halfway into the wall. Then in edit mode, I delete the back faces of the bricks since I won't be needing them. In object mode, I add a mirror modifier to the bricks. And I use the wall as the mirror object with it being mirrored along the y-axis. I then apply the modifier. Select the bricks and the wall and join them using Ctrl-J and apply the scale. I then rename the asset in the outliner. Make sure the 3D cursor is at the bottom center of the cube. Under the object menu, I set the origin to the 3D cursor. And then I hide the wall. Now I'll move on to the steps. I'll add a cube, change the X and Y dimensions to 6 feet, and the Z dimension to 3 feet. And I rename the object in the outliner. In edit mode, I select the top front edge, and using Ctrl B, I add a bevel. And I open up the bevel popover menu, and I increase the segment. I choose custom for the profile type, and then I choose steps from the presets. Since these steps will need to stack, and they may end up on the end of a section of the map, I need to make them long enough to allow me to stack them without the need to add extra pieces to the bottom to fill in the wall underneath the steps. I select the bottom face, and I extrude it down along the z-axis by 18 feet. And I make sure that the cursor is at the bottom center of the original section of the cube, and under the Object menu, I set the origin to the 3D cursor, and I apply the scale. Now I'm going to add some materials to these objects. Since this will be used in a game engine and it is low poly, I will only be using the principled shader and the smart UV unwrap method for the objects. We need to save as much as we can on materials within a game engine, and this is especially true for mobile games. I'll be using only one UV map, which will be a series of colors that I will make in Photoshop, but this can be done in any similar program. In Photoshop, I made a 2048 by 2048 image with a transparent background. I then added a new layer, and I used the rectangle tool to make a square that is 256 by 256 pixels, and then filled it with white. I then repeated the process for 4 more squares, for black, and for 3 tones of gray. I then saved the image out as a PNG, but you can also use a JPEG. Also remember to save this image as a PSD or whatever the native file type is for your software you're using, since it will be needed in part 2. Under the shading workspace in Blender, I unhide the floor, I make a new material, give it a name, then I add an image texture node, and open the image I just made in Photoshop, and connect it to the base color. I change the roughness to 0.9. Then I unhide and select each of the other objects, and using the drop-down menu beside the material name, I assign the same material to each object. Under the UV editing workspace, I make sure that I have the materials UV map open. I select the floor, and using the U key, I bring up the unwrapping menu and choose Smart UV Project. I then scale the UV floors down place them on the mid-gray color. Then I repeat this process for each of the other objects. Then export the UV layout. Now I select each object and export it as an FBX. And make sure that I have selected objects checked, so that I only export the selected object. And I make sure that I export these into a separate folder for assets. In Godot, I drag and drop the assets folder into the file system. I also drag and drop the material texture file. Starting with the floor, I double click on the asset and make a new inherited scene. Under the materials section, I add a new spatial material. Double click the spatial material and open up the albedo section. I then drag and drop the material texture onto the texture slot. I then save the scene in a new folder. I repeat this process for each of the assets. Now I'll make a new 3D scene to test out all the assets by making a simple level design. I'll use the instance scene, which is the little link icon, to add the object to the scene. Then I'll duplicate the object using Ctrl D, and then place them around the scene to make a level. Go ahead and continue to build out the level. And remember to save this Godot project to be used in part 2. Thanks for watching. I hope you found this useful. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and turn on the notifications. Have a good day.